George Cooper didn't die on the worst day of his life. That would have been easier. He died on the day his wife finally told him to chase his dream. The day his boss told him he was good enough for college football. The day his family started planning a new life around him instead of expecting him to sacrifice another piece of himself for them. Then George walked out of his kitchen. Nobody said goodbye. A few hours later, two men arrived at his front door, while the entire Cooper family was dressed in white, waiting to take a photograph George would never appear in. That was not bad timing. The writers admitted they designed it that way. Season 7, Episode 12, A New Home and a Traditional Texas Torture, pretends it's about Sheldon leaving for California. 42 days until Caltech. One final visit to the comic book store. One last lunch with Tam. One graduation speech. One ridiculous bluebonnet family portrait Mary is forcing everyone to take. George hears about the photograph and immediately groans. He doesn't want to dress in white and stand in a field filled with insects. It feels like another harmless family argument. It isn't, because that stupid photograph becomes the clock counting down the final hours of George Cooper's life. But before the clock reaches 4, the show gives him something it had denied him for 7 seasons. Recognition. Principal Petersen calls George into his office. One of Petersen's contacts at Rice University has been asking about him. A college coaching opportunity is coming. Not another struggling high school team. Not another season begging teenagers to follow instructions. Rice University. The kind of job George probably stopped believing he would ever get. Petersen tells George he recommended him because he genuinely thinks George belongs there. George jokes because that's what George does when something matters too much. But look at Lance Barber's face. The smile is different. This isn't George laughing over a beer or celebrating one football victory. This is a man realizing that somebody outside his own house has looked at his entire life and decided he is worth more. And that alone would make the scene painful. But the writers planted the real weapon 6 years earlier. Go back to Season 2, Episode 9, Family Dynamics and a Red Fiero. George is offered a better coaching job in Oklahoma. More money, more opportunity, a chance to improve his family's life. Mary doesn't celebrate. She fights him. Thanksgiving dinner explodes. The children panic. George drives to Tulsa, takes the tour, and stands inches away from the future he wants. Then he turns it down. He comes home and pretends Oklahoma was the problem. Adult Sheldon admits he didn't understand the sacrifice his father had made. George enters his bedroom looking defeated, while the children celebrate because their lives will not have to change. Watch that scene without the comedy rhythm? A man gives up his dream. His family cheers. That is the wound Episode 12 returns to. George enters the bedroom expecting another argument about Rice. Instead, Mary stops him. She says he should take it. George actually asks whether she is certain because experience has trained him not to trust this moment. But Mary lists the reasons it could work. Georgie and Mandy have moved out. Sheldon is leaving for Caltech. Missy will be starting a new school. For once, the timing is right. Then Mary says the words George has needed to hear since Season 2. George, you deserve this. George admits that college football has always been his dream. Mary hugs him. They laugh. That is the best day of George Cooper's life. Not because Rice has the biggest stadium, because for the first time, George does not have to choose between his dream and his family. His family chooses the dream with him. There's a psychological principle called the peak end rule. It means people tend to remember an experience through its most emotionally intense moment and the way that experience ends, rather than every moment in between. The writers build George's final episode around that exact trap. The peak is Rice. The end is the front door. But they aren't finished twisting the knife yet. At dinner, George and Mary announce the move. Missy is thrilled. Houston has malls, Six Flags, a new high school where she won't immediately be known as Sheldon Cooper's less intelligent sister. Georgie jokes. Meemaw congratulates George. The only person furious is Sheldon, even though he is leaving Texas in 41 days. Sheldon storms into his bedroom because his parents might sell the house. George tries reasoning with him. Mary finally shuts it down. She tells Sheldon this job is good for his father. Stop there. Mary Cooper, the woman who opposed Oklahoma in Season 2, is now standing between George and the child whose needs have controlled almost every major decision in their marriage. She chooses George, and Sheldon still makes George's victory about himself. That matters because George is going to die before Sheldon gets a chance to understand what he just did. Subscribe because Cooper Untold is opening the scenes this family spent decades misunderstanding, and George's final morning is where the entire story turns ugly. Before leaving for work, George offers Missy a ride. She says she'll take the bus. Mary reminds him that the family photograph is at 4. George promises he won't miss it. Then he looks toward his family and says, "See y'all." Nothing. Missy keeps packing. Mary keeps moving around the kitchen. Sheldon doesn't even raise his eyes from his cereal. George opens the door. Leaves. That is the last time his family sees him alive. There is no dramatic argument. No final hug. No swelling speech telling the audience to prepare themselves. That was deliberate too. Showrunner Steve Holland explained that they wanted George's departure to feel like an ordinary morning because real families do not recognize their final moments while they are happening. Dad is just going to work. There will always be another goodbye. Until there isn't. But episode 12 distracts you immediately. Sheldon worries about losing his bedroom. Missy prepares for a fresh start. A realtor tours the Cooper house. George climbs onto the roof with Georgie to inspect the shingles. That roof scene looks like another father and son comedy beat. Strip away the jokes. George tells Georgie that one day he will own a house and need to understand how to maintain it. Georgie says he plans to become rich enough to pay somebody else. George tells him he hopes he gets to see that. He doesn't. Georgie becomes the successful businessman George suspected he could become. But George never sees the tire empire. Never sees Georgie carry the family. Never sees his oldest son become the man protecting everybody after his death. The writers placed that conversation on George's final day. That was goodbye number 2. Nobody recognized it. At 4 o'clock, everyone gathers in the living room. White shirts, clean clothes. Cece ready. Sheldon wearing peppermint oil to repel bees. They're irritated because George is late. Then somebody knocks. Mary opens the door. Principal Petersen and Coach Wilkins are standing there, but George isn't between them. Mary knows before they speak. She asks where he is. Petersen struggles to explain that George suffered another heart attack at work. Missy asks whether he is okay. Petersen says he's gone. Meemaw grabs Missy. Mary's breathing collapses. Sheldon slowly lowers himself into a chair, while the sound of his family crying disappears around him. That silence is the real ending of George Cooper's life. Not the heart attack, the empty space where the photograph was supposed to be. And here's what makes it worse. George's death was never a surprise to anyone who watched The Big Bang Theory. We knew Sheldon's father died when Sheldon was 14. The first season of Young Sheldon even showed George surviving an earlier heart attack in episode 3, Poker, Faith and Eggs. The show warned us. Then it trained us not to believe the warning. George survived before. He would survive again. He was planning Houston, selling the house, fixing the roof, taking the photograph. The future looked too detailed to disappear. That was the trick. The writers did not hide death. They buried it beneath life. Holland later confirmed that the team intentionally constructed episode 12 as a misdirection. He said it was important to give George a win, specifically connecting Rice to the Oklahoma opportunity George surrendered in Season 2. Read that again. They knew George was about to die, but before killing him, they went back 6 seasons, found the dream he had sacrificed for his family, and returned it to him. Not so he could live it, so he could die holding it. That is the peak end rule being used like a weapon. If George died after another argument with Mary, the argument would contaminate our final memory of him. If he died after drinking at the bar, people would say adult Sheldon had been right. If he died after failing at football, he would remain the disappointing father The Big Bang Theory spent years describing. So the writers gave him a peak powerful enough to crush that version. George was wanted by Rice, supported by Mary, needed by his children, still planning his future. Then the story ended him. But Sheldon's memory did something even darker. It turned the end into a lifelong defense mechanism. In Season 7, Episode 13, Funeral, Sheldon repeatedly replays George's final morning. In one version, he gives his father a Star Trek farewell. In another, he simply says goodbye. Then he tells George he loves him. Then he asks to ride to work with him. Every fantasy ends with George turning back toward his son. But none of them happened. Sheldon said nothing. At the funeral, Sheldon imagines himself walking to the microphone and admitting that he barely noticed his father leaving. Then reality returns. Sheldon never approaches the microphone. He remains seated. Adult Sheldon finally explains what happened afterward. For years, he focused on George's shortcomings. The writers later said that concentrating on his father's faults was easier than confronting the pain and regret surrounding the things Sheldon never said. That changes the Big Bang Theory completely. Every joke about George being stupid, every imitation of George drinking, every story where Sheldon reduces his father to an embarrassing Texas stereotype. Those weren't objective case files. They were armor. The peak end rule explains why Sheldon gets George so wrong. Sheldon doesn't remember the thousands of ordinary mornings when George went to work and came home. He remembers the one morning George didn't. He remembers sitting at breakfast. He remembers refusing to look up. He remembers an unanswered goodbye. So he spends decades shrinking George into his worst traits, because admitting George was good would mean admitting exactly what Sheldon lost. And worse, what he failed to notice while George was still alive. The Big Bang Theory eventually exposes the damage in Season 11, Episode 23, The Sibling Realignment. Adult Georgie tells Sheldon what happened after their father died. Mary fell apart. Missy was still a teenager. Sheldon left for California. Georgie stayed and handled the family. Sheldon genuinely believed Mary had taken care of everything. Georgie has to explain that he was the one carrying the weight, while also protecting Sheldon from knowing how bad things had become. George's heart stopped. Georgie immediately inherited his job. Not football coach. Father. That is why Mary's funeral speech is so brutal. She does not give the clean church speech she prepared. She reaches the microphone and breaks. She says she is angry because she and George were finally in such a good place. Finally. After the Oklahoma fight. After Pastor Rob. After Brenda. After money problems, church problems, parenting disasters, and years of sleeping beside a man she loved but frequently failed to understand. They finally reached the good place. Then the writers killed him inside it. They did not kill George because he had nothing left. They killed him because he suddenly had everything to lose. The college career. Houston. A possible swimming pool. Missy's new beginning. Mary's support. Georgie's future. The family photograph. Every detail existed solely to create a future the audience could see clearly enough to mourn. That is why George's death hurts more than a normal television death. You are not only grieving the man, you are grieving Houston. You are grieving Rice. You are grieving the house they never bought and the games George never coached. You are grieving the moment Georgie became rich and instinctively looked for the father who said he wanted to witness it. You are grieving a photograph that was scheduled for 4 o'clock. The photograph never happened, but the entire family still spent the rest of their lives trapped inside it. Missy held on to the father who treated her like more than Sheldon's twin. Georgie became the man George had been. Mary disappeared deeper into religion. Sheldon turned George into a collection of flaws until he became a father himself and finally understood what George had been doing. Trying, failing, sacrificing, getting up the next morning and trying again. Adult Sheldon eventually admits that he loved his father and would miss him forever. But George never heard it. The viewers did. Decades too late. Put the George scene that destroyed you in the comments, because this family has more buried inside it than 7 seasons could hold. But remember what the writers actually did. George Cooper didn't die on his worst